The morning of May 24, 1943, in the North Atlantic, approximately 400 miles southwest of Iceland, Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Barksten stood in the conning tower of U-521, scanning an empty horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. The sea was moderate, the sky overcast with broken clouds at perhaps 2,000 feet. Perfect conditions for a surface transit to recharge batteries and refresh the fetid air below. His diesel engines rumbled steadily beneath his feet, pushing the Type 9C submarine at 14 knots toward the convoy routes. Barksten had been at sea for 31 days. His crew of 48 men had settled into the rhythm of Atlantic patrol. Surface at night and in poor weather, submerge at the first hint of aircraft, hunt during twilight hours when visibility favored the submarine. They had sunk one freighter 11 days earlier, a straggler from a scattered convoy, and were now repositioning based on decoded obedience intercepts, suggesting another convoy would pass through their patrol zone within 72 hours. The war was becoming harder. Barksten knew this. More escorts, better radar, longer-range aircraft, but the fundamental equation remained. When submerged, a U-boat was nearly invisible, detectable only by active sonar from surface ships. And those ships had to be close, very close, within perhaps 2,000 yards under ideal conditions. Aircraft were a nuisance, forcing you down, interrupting your transit, but once you submerged beyond periscope depth, you were safe. The aircraft could see nothing, detect nothing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 0943 hours, the port lookout called out contact. Aircraft, bearing 270, range approximately 8 miles, altitude perhaps 3,000 feet. Barksten didn't hesitate. Alarm, clear the bridge. The lookouts dropped through the hatch in seconds. Barksten took one last look at the approaching aircraft, a twin-engine type, possibly American, then followed them down, pulling the hatch shut and dogging it tight. Flood! The chief engineer opened the vents. Seawater roared into the ballast tanks. The deck tilted forward. U-521 slipped beneath the surface in less than 30 seconds. Level off at 100 meters, Barksten ordered. Silent running, all unnecessary machinery secure. The boat descended into the green-black depths. At 100 meters, roughly 330 feet, the chief trimmed the boat carefully, adjusting ballast and using the smallest possible movements of the diving planes. The crew moved with practiced silence, speaking in whispers, avoiding unnecessary contact with the hull. Every man knew the procedure. Remain quiet, remain deep, wait for the aircraft to depart. The enemy could not touch. You hear? Barksten checked his watch. They would remain submerged for at least 2 hours, letting the aircraft exhaust its patrol time and depart. Then they would surface, restart the diesels, and continue their mission. It was an inconvenience, nothing more. Except this time, the aircraft didn't leave. At 0958, 15 minutes after diving, the soundman reported propeller noise, fast-moving surface contact, bearing 345, range closing. Barksten frowned. How? They had submerged miles from the aircraft's position. They had made no noise. Their electric motors were barely turning, providing just enough thrust to maintain depth and steering. There should be no way for a surface vessel to know where they were. Yet the propeller sounds grew louder, more distinct. Not one ship, but two, both converging on their position with the deliberate certainty of ships that knew exactly where their target lay. To understand what was happening to U-521, and to understand why Klaus Barksten could not comprehend how he had been found, you must understand what German submariners believed about their boats, and why they believed it. The foundation of U-boat warfare rested on a simple principle that had proven itself correct thousands of times. Beneath the surface, submarines were effectively invisible to anything except close-range sonar from surface ships. This was not propaganda or wishful thinking. This was verified operational experience, spanning nearly 4 years of war. When the war began in September 1939, U-boats operated under constraints established by prize rules and international law. constraints that were quickly abandoned as the conflict intensified. By 1940 and 1941, unrestricted submarine warfare had become the standard, and U-boats began demonstrating their lethal potential. The statistics spoke clearly. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank approximately 1,200 Allied merchant ships, totaling over 6 million tons of shipping. Individual boats achieved remarkable success. U-48, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Herbert Schulze, sank 35 ships. U-99, under Joachim Schepke, sank 39. Otto Kretschmer in U-99 sank 47 ships before his capture in March 1941. These were not lucky accidents. These were the results of systematic training, sound tactics, and technological advantages that German submariners understood and exploited. The Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats that formed the backbone of the fleet were sophisticated machines, products of German engineering expertise and interwar development. The Type 9C, the variant Barksten commanded, displaced 1,020 tons surfaced, 1,144 tons submerged. It stretched 252 feet from bow to stern, with a pressure hull diameter of 15.5 feet. Could withstand pressure to depths of 150 meters operationally, with a theoretical crush depth around 230 meters. The boat carried 14 torpedoes for its 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft. It mounted 105mm deck gun, useful for surface engagements with unarmed merchants, and anti-aircraft weapons that increased in number and caliber as the war progressed. 2,000 horsepower diesel engines on the surface could push the boat to 18 knots. Electric motors powered by massive banks of lead-acid batteries could maintain 7 knots submerged for brief periods, or creep at 4 knots for considerably longer. The operational range was extraordinary. 12,000 nautical miles at 12 knots surfaced, 63 nautical miles at 4 knots submerged. But the technology mattered less than what the technology enabled, and what it enabled was invisibility. When a U-boat submerged, it vanished from the taze after technology, enemy's awareness. Aircraft could not see beneath the surface beyond perhaps 30 or 40 feet in perfect conditions, and those perfect conditions rarely existed in the North Atlantic. Surface ships could detect submarines using sonar, called ASTIC by the British. But ASTIC had severe limitations. It was active sonar, meaning it sent out a sound pulse and listened for echoes. The pulse had to travel to the target and return to be detected. At ranges beyond 2,000 yards, detection became unreliable. Temperature layers in the water, called thermoclines, could deflect the sonar pulse, creating shadow zones where submarines could hide. German submariners developed tactical doctrines based on these physical realities. The procedures were taught at U-boat schools, practiced during Baltic training missions, refined through operational experience, and passed from veteran crews to new arrivals. When aircraft appeared, you dived immediately. Speed was essential because aircraft could cover distance rapidly, arriving overhead within minutes. Once submerged, you went deep, to at least 100 meters if the water depth permitted. At this depth, you were safe from almost everything the enemy possessed. Aircraft depth charges set for shallow detonation would explode far above you. Surface ship sonar became less effective as depth increased. You maintained silent running, securing all unnecessary equipment to minimize noise. The cook didn't prepare meals. Repair work stopped. Crew members moved carefully, avoiding metal-to-metal contact. Conversations occurred in whispers. Even breathing seemed too loud. The soundman, often called the hydrophone operator, became the boat's primary sense organ, listening through passive underwater microphones for propeller sounds, for the ping of active sonar, for the splash of depth charges entering the water. His reports guided the commander's decisions. Which way to turn, how deep to go, when to creep, and when to sprint using the electric motors at full power despite the battery drain. The waiting was psychological warfare against yourself. In the cramped interior, lit by red emergency lighting to preserve night vision, men sat or stood at their stations, maintaining their equipment, holding themselves still. The air grew progressively worse as carbon dioxide accumulated. After several hours submerged, every breath required conscious effort. Headaches developed, concentration faltered. The diesel engine smell that permeated every surface mixed with unwashed bodies, cooking odors, bilge water, and the metallic tang of the machinery. Some men vomited from the bad air. Others simply endured. But you endured because you knew that above you, the enemy was searching blindly. Unless they had seen you dive, they didn't know where you were. The ocean was vast, the Atlantic was deep, and once you slipped beneath the surface, you had effectively disappeared. If they dropped depth charges, they were guessing, trying to force you to the surface or hoping for a lucky hit. If they pinged with sonar, they might detect you at close range, but sonar range was so limited that you could often evade by simply going deeper or turning away. This was the doctrine. Submerge, go deep, go quiet, wait. The enemy cannot find what they cannot detect, and they cannot detect a submarine at depth maintaining silence. Thousands of successful evasions had proven this. Barksten himself had evaded aircraft on 17 previous occasions during his career. Every time, the procedure had worked. Dive, wait, surface when clear. Except now, on May 24, 1943, surface ships were converging on his position with impossible accuracy, and Klaus Barksten was about to discover that everything his experience had taught him was becoming obsolete. What Klaus Barksten could not know, what no U-boat commander in the Atlantic could know in May 1943, was that the fundamental rules of submarine warfare had changed. The change had not come from a single breakthrough but from a convergence of technologies, and the most revolutionary of these was a device that seemed impossible by the logic of existing warfare. A disposable, air-dropped acoustic sensor that could listen for submarines from the air. The Sonobuoy was born from a simple recognition of a fundamental problem. Aircraft were excellent at covering vast areas of ocean, but their ability to detect submarines was limited to visual sighting, which required the submarine to be on the surface or at periscope depth in clear water. Once a submarine dived, the aircraft was blind. Surface ships had sonar, but they moved slowly and could only search small areas. What was needed was a way to combine aircraft mobility with underwater acoustic detection. Development began in the United States in 1937, when researchers at the Naval Research Laboratory began experimenting with radioacoustic buoys. The concept was straightforward. Drop a floating device from an aircraft, have it listen for submarine sounds using a hydrophone, and transmit what it heard back to the aircraft using a radio transmitter. The execution was considerably more complex. Early prototypes were unreliable, too heavy, too fragile, or simply didn't work in operational conditions. By 1941, as the United States entered the war, the development effort intensified. The Columbia University Division of War Research took over much of the work, collaborating with industrial partners to create a practical, mass-producible device. The breakthrough came with the CRT-1 Sonobuoy, which entered operational service in 1942. The device was elegantly simple in concept, sophisticated in execution. It consisted of a cylindrical canister approximately 4 feet long and 5 inches in diameter, weighing 35 pounds. Inside was a hydrophone suspended on a cable that would hang approximately 24 feet below the surface, a radio transmitter operating at around 60 megahertz, batteries to power the system for approximately 3 hours, and a seawater-activated switch that turned everything on when the device hit the water. The Sonobuoy was dropped from aircraft flying at altitudes between 1,000 and 3,000 feet, typically much lower than the hyperbolic 10,000 feet suggested in popular accounts, but still high enough to provide good patrol range and low enough for accurate placement. When it hit the water, a small drogue parachute deployed to keep it vertical. The hydrophone descended to its operating depth. The radio antenna extended upward. Within seconds, the device began transmitting acoustic data back to the aircraft. The aircraft carried a receiver tuned to the Sonobuoy's frequency. An operator wearing headphones listened to the underwater sounds being transmitted. He could hear propeller noise, mechanical sounds from submarines, even the characteristic whine of electric motors. Multiple sonobuoys could be dropped in a pattern, creating an acoustic net that could triangulate a submarine's position. The system had limitations. The sonobuoys were passive sensors, meaning they only listened. They did not emit sound like active sonar. This made them harder to detect, but also meant they required the submarine to make noise. Range was limited to perhaps 2 or 3 miles under good conditions. Sea conditions affected performance. Rough seas created background noise that made detection difficult. The 3-hour battery life meant sonobuoys had to be used strategically, not scattered randomly. But within these limitations, the technology was revolutionary. For the first time, aircraft could detect submerged submarines beyond visual range. A patrol plane could drop a pattern of sonobuoys, fly a search pattern while monitoring the returns, and direct surface ships to exact locations where submarines had been detected. The submarine's invisibility was gone. By May 1943, American and British patrol aircraft operating in the Atlantic were using sonobuoys routinely. The PBY Catalina flying boats carried them. The PV-1 Ventura land-based patrol bombers carried them. The TBF Avenger carrier-based aircraft carried them. Thousands had been manufactured and distributed to operational squadrons. Procedures had been developed, tactics refined, successes documented. What had been experimental technology in 1942 had become standard equipment in 1943. German intelligence knew something had changed. U-boat losses were increasing, and many boats simply disappeared without explanation. But the Germans did not understand the sonobuoy system. They knew aircraft were becoming more effective, that radar had improved, that attacks seemed to occur with suspicious accuracy. Some captured Allied equipment had been examined, but the full scope of the acoustic detection network remained unclear to German naval intelligence through much of 1943, and even into 1944. U-521's predicament was worsening. The propeller sounds, reported by the soundman, were now accompanied by the distinctive ping of active sonar. Not random searching, but directed pulses that seemed to know where to look. Barksten ordered a course change, turning the boat 90 degrees and increasing speed to 6 knots on the electric motors. The maneuver should have broken contact. At 100 meters depth, with the boat relatively quiet, the enemy should have lost them in the vastness of the ocean. Instead, 15 minutes later, the soundman reported the surface ships had altered course to follow. They were still closing. Then came a sound that made every experienced submariner's blood freeze, the splash of objects hitting the water above them. Multiple splashes in rapid succession. Depth charges. Brace for depth charges, Barksten called out. The crew grabbed hold of pipes, valve wheels, anything solid. Some sat on the deck, backs against bulkheads. The soundman ripped off his headphones to protect his ears. The first depth charge detonated approximately 150 meters away, close enough to rock the boat but not close enough to cause damage. The hull groaned under the pressure wave, cork insulation fell from overhead, light bulbs shattered. The second and third charges were farther away, the enemy adjusting their aim. Then silence, the propeller sounds receding. Barksten waited 20 minutes, then ordered another course change. They crept south at 4 knots, barely making headway, conserving battery power. The air was becoming seriously bad. Men were breathing in short, shallow gasps. Carbon dioxide levels were approaching dangerous concentrations. At 1100 hours, nearly 90 minutes after the first detection, the soundman reported propeller sounds again. Bearing 090, range closing. A different ship this time. Or perhaps the same ships had repositioned. Either way, they were coming back, and once again, they seemed to know where to look. Barksten was an experienced commander, not prone to panic, but he was now confronting something that violated his understanding of submarine warfare. How were they being found? The boat was deep, quiet, and had changed position multiple times. There should be no way for surface ships to track them with such precision, unless they had some form of detection capability that German doctrine didn't account for. The second depth charge attack came at 11:20 hours. This time, the charges were closer, detonating in a pattern around the boat. The pressure waves hammered the hull. Metal groaned, rivets popped. A seam in the pressure hull began weeping water, a small stream that the crew stuffed with rags and wooden wedges. The electric motor controllers sparked, the gyro compass tumbled, becoming useless. More cork insulation rained down. In the engine room, one of the electric motors developed a high-pitched whine from damaged bearings. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The attack pattern was methodical, almost casual. The surface ships would close to within sonar range, confirm the submarine's position, move directly overhead, and drop depth charges. The charges would detonate, the ships would move off, wait, then return, and repeat the process. They were not trying to sink U-521 with a single devastating attack. They were systematically damaging the boat, forcing it deeper, draining its batteries, exhausting its crew, and waiting for the inevitable moment when the submarine would have to surface. Barksten considered his options. He could attempt to creep away at minimal speed, hoping to break contact, but the enemy kept finding him regardless of his maneuvers. He could go deeper, but the boat was already at 120 meters, approaching the safe limit of its depth rating. And going deeper would not help if the enemy could still detect him. He could sprint on the electric motors, using full power to create distance, but that would drain the batteries in less than an hour and make more noise, possibly making detection easier. At 12:30 hours, after nearly 3 hours submerged, the situation became critical. Battery power was down to 20%. The air was so foul that men were losing consciousness. The carbon dioxide scrubbers were saturated, unable to remove more poison from the atmosphere. Damage from the depth charges had created multiple leaks. The bilge pumps were running continuously, consuming more precious battery power. The boat was slowly becoming heavier as water accumulated, requiring constant adjustment of the trim to maintain depth. Barksten made the only decision possible. They would attempt to surface and run. If the enemy ships were close, they would fight with the deck gun and anti-aircraft weapons. If the ships were distant, they would sprint on the surface at full diesel speed, trying to create enough separation to dive again in a different location. It was desperate, but remaining submerged meant certain death from asphyxiation or battery exhaustion. "Prepare to surface," Barksten ordered. Gun crews to action stations. Engine room, prepare for immediate start on diesels. All ahead full once we break surface. The crew moved to their positions, some crawling because they lacked the strength to walk. The torpedo gang prepared to open the forward hatch and man the deck gun. The anti-aircraft crews gathered at the base of the conning tower ladder. Surface. The chief engineer blew the ballast tanks. Compressed air roared into the tanks, forcing water out. The boat angled upward sharply. Barksten climbed into the conning tower, one hand on the hatch wheel, ready to open it the moment they broke surface. The depth gauge unwound. 80 meters, 60 meters, 40 meters, 20 meters. The boat's momentum carried it upward. They broke surface at 12:41 hours. Barksten spun the hatch wheel and threw it open. Fresh air rushed in, beautiful, clean Atlantic air. He pulled himself up and out, binoculars already at his eyes, scanning desperately for the enemy. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. 2 destroyers, both approximately 3,000 meters away, one on the port quarter, one on the starboard bow. Both were turning toward him, increasing speed, bow waves building as they accelerated to attack speed. Above and behind the destroyers, an aircraft, twin-engine, circling at perhaps 2,000 feet. The aircraft had been coordinating the entire attack. But how? Barksten had never surfaced. The boat had been submerged for 3 hours, changing position constantly. Yet the aircraft had maintained contact, somehow guiding the destroyers to his location with precision that should have been impossible. The deck gun crew tumbled out of the forward hatch and ran to their weapon, but Barksten knew it was futile. The destroyers would be in gun range within minutes, and their 5-inch guns outranged his obsolete 105mm deck gun. The aircraft would strafe them if they remained on the surface. "Clear the deck, prepare to dive." The gun crew abandoned their weapon and scrambled back toward the hatch. Barksten took one last look at the approaching destroyers, trying to fix their positions in his mind, then dropped back into the conning tower and dogged the hatch. Flood, take her down. Emergency dive, 150 meters. The boat tilted forward again, diving with the last reserves of compressed air and battery power. This time, Barksten knew they might not survive. The batteries were nearly exhausted, the air was poison, the boat had damage that was getting worse, and somehow, impossibly, the enemy could find them underwater. At 1300 hours, approximately 3.5 hours after the initial dive, the third depth charge attack began. The enemy had been waiting for them to dive again. The charges were close, very close, detonating in a pattern that seemed to bracket the boat precisely. The hull shrieked under the pressure. The lights failed completely, plunging the interior into darkness broken only by emergency hand lamps. Seawater sprayed from multiple hull penetrations. The stern planes jammed in the down position, sending the boat into an uncontrolled descent toward the crush depth. In the engine room, both electric motors failed simultaneously, their damaged bearings seizing. U-521 was sinking, powerless, flooding, with no way to surface, and no way to escape. In the darkness and chaos, Klaus Barksten finally understood that he had been fighting an enemy he could not see, using technology he did not understand, detecting him through methods his training had never prepared him for. The ocean that had hidden submarines for decades was no longer a sanctuary. Something had changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. And that change meant that boats like his were no longer invisible hunters, but visible prey. U-521 did not sink that day, though it came within perhaps 30 meters of its crush depth before the crew regained control. In the pitch darkness, with water spraying from a dozen hull penetrations and the boat tilting at a dangerous angle, the engineering crew performed what can only be described as a miracle of damage control. They manually operated the diving plane controls, using nothing but muscle power and mechanical advantage to force the jammed stern planes back to neutral. They shifted ballast forward by having men physically carry heavy equipment toward the bow. They stuffed leaks with mattresses, wooden wedges, and anything else that could stop the inflow of seawater. Slowly, agonizingly, the boat's descent arrested. At 168 meters, deeper than the boat had ever been designed to go, U-521 stabilized. But stabilizing was not surviving. The batteries were dead, providing perhaps 15 minutes of emergency power. The air was toxic, with carbon dioxide levels so high that men were hallucinating. The hull was compromised in multiple locations, the electric motors were destroyed. The boat could not move under its own power, could not surface using its normal systems, and could not remain submerged without air and electricity. Barksten made the final, terrible decision. They would perform an emergency surface blow, using the last of their compressed air to force the boat to the surface, and they would surrender to the enemy rather than die from asphyxiation in a crippled submarine. At 13:45 hours, 4 hours after the ordeal began, U-521 broke surface for the last time. The crew emerged into daylight to find themselves surrounded. Both destroyers had closed to within 1,000 meters. The aircraft was circling overhead. There was no possibility of escape, no chance to fight, no option except surrender. Barksten ordered the boat abandoned and scuttled. The crew opened the vents to flood the submarine while they climbed into life rafts. The destroyers approached cautiously, their guns trained on the survivors. Within 20 minutes, U-521 slipped beneath the surface and sank to the ocean floor, joining hundreds of other U-boats that would never return to port. The survivors, 43 men out of the original 48, 5 having died during the depth charge attacks or from injuries sustained in the emergency ascent, were picked up by the American destroyers and taken to port. There, in prisoner of war camps in the United States and Canada, they began to piece together what had happened to them, through conversations with interrogators, through observation of Allied equipment and procedures, through the gradual accumulation of information that prisoners acquire. German submariners learned about the technology that had defeated them. The Sonobuoy was not a secret by late 1943 and into 1944. Allied forces used them openly, and captured crews saw them, heard about them, and realized that the invisible detection they had experienced was the result of airdropped acoustic sensors. For men like Barksten, who had survived the experience, the knowledge was both relieving and devastating. Relieving because it explained what had seemed inexplicable: the impossible accuracy of the attacks, the way surface ships had tracked their movements underwater. Devastating because it meant the fundamental premise of U-boat warfare, that submerged submarines were invisible, was no longer true. German naval intelligence eventually learned about sonobuoys through prisoner interrogations, captured equipment, and signals intelligence. Reports were compiled and sent back to U-boat headquarters in Germany. Tactical recommendations were issued: maintain deeper depths, reduce noise even further, limit submerged movement when aircraft were present. But these countermeasures were inadequate against the reality of Allied anti-submarine warfare in 1943 and beyond. The Sonobuoy was just one component of an integrated system that included centimetric radar that could detect surfaced submarines in darkness and poor weather, high-frequency direction, finding equipment that could locate U-boats by their radio transmissions, long-range patrol aircraft that could cover vast areas of ocean, escort carriers that brought air power to convoy routes, improved depth charges with better fusing and more powerful explosives, and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars that could attack submarines without the attacking ship passing directly overhead. The statistical evidence of the Sonobuoy's impact, combined with other Allied anti-submarine technologies, appears in the cold numbers of U-boat losses. In 1942, at the height of U-boat success, Germany lost 87 U-boats while sinking over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The exchange ratio favored the submarines. In 1943, as sonobuoys, improved radar, and other technologies entered widespread service, Germany lost 237 U-boats while sinking approximately 3 million tons of shipping. The exchange ratio had reversed. By 1944, losses exceeded 240 boats with diminishing returns against increasingly well-defended convoys. The human cost of this technological shift was borne by the U-boat crews themselves. Of approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, approximately 28,000 died, a casualty rate of 72%, the highest of any branch of any military in World War II. These were not random casualties spread across years of combat. The majority occurred in 1943, 1944, and 1945, as the technological balance shifted decisively against the submarines. The men who died in those boats experienced something psychologically unique in modern warfare. They were killed by enemies they could not see, using detection methods they did not understand, in an environment where their traditional advantages had evaporated. A soldier on land could see his enemy, could understand when he was outgunned or outmaneuvered. A pilot could see enemy aircraft and know when he was overmatched. But a submariner being hunted by Sonobuoy-equipped aircraft and destroyers experienced an almost supernatural form of warfare. The enemy seemed omniscient, appearing from nowhere, attacking with precision, departing and returning as if guided by invisible threads. For the Allied personnel operating this technology, the experience was entirely different. The sonobuoy operators, sitting in patrol aircraft, listening through headphones to underwater sounds transmitted from floating sensors miles away, were participating in a form of warfare that seemed almost like science fiction. They could hear submarines running submerged, could track their movements, could guide surface ships to attack positions, all without the submarine knowing it was being detected. The technology gave them godlike awareness of an environment that had previously been opaque. The British and American sailors on destroyers and escort vessels, who received sonobuoy contact reports and executed the attacks, experienced the satisfaction of hunting an enemy that had once seemed invulnerable. Where U-boats had terrorized convoys in 1940 and 1941, attacking at night with impunity, now those same submarines were being systematically destroyed. The psychological shift was profound. Merchant mariners who had crossed the Atlantic in fear, knowing that torpedoes could strike without warning, now sailed in convoys protected by technology that turned the hunters into the hunted. The industrial capacity that produced sonobuoys in sufficient quantity to equip patrol squadrons across the Atlantic also revealed the resource disparity that would ultimately decide the war. The United States manufactured approximately 150,000 sonobuoys during the war, treating them as expendable equipment to be used liberally and replaced constantly. Each patrol aircraft carried dozens. Each patrol area was saturated with sensors. The lavish use of sophisticated technology reflected an industrial base that could produce complex electronics in mass quantities, something Germany could not match even if German engineers had developed equivalent technology. The war had become, among other things, a contest of industrial production. And in that contest, the Allied advantage was overwhelming. The Sonobuoy represented more than just a tactical innovation. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of submarine warfare that would extend far beyond World War II. The principle that submarines could be detected acoustically from aircraft, using disposable sensors deployed in patterns, would evolve into sophisticated anti-submarine warfare systems used throughout the Cold War and into the present day. Modern sonobuoys are vastly more capable than their World War II ancestors, using digital signal processing, longer battery life, and multiple acoustic sensors in single units. But the fundamental concept, established in the early 1940s, remains unchanged. Extend acoustic detection beyond the range of individual platforms by deploying distributed sensors that report back to aircraft or ships. For the men who survived U-boat service and returned to Germany after the war, the knowledge that their boats had been hunted by technology they never understood created a lasting sense of betrayal. Not betrayal by the Allies, who were simply prosecuting the war with whatever means they possessed, but betrayal by their own command structure that had sent them to sea in boats that were increasingly obsolete against enemies who possessed technological superiority. German submariners had been told they possessed the most advanced submarines in the world. They had been assured that German technology was superior. The reality, discovered through bitter experience and catastrophic losses, was that technological advantage had shifted decisively to the Allies by mid-war. Klaus Barksten survived his captivity and returned to Germany after the war ended. He lived until 1984, long enough to see submarines evolve into nuclear-powered vessels that could remain submerged for months, equipped with sensors and weapons that would have seemed like fantasy to World War II submariners. In interviews conducted years after the war, Barksten and other U-boat veterans consistently mentioned the psychological impact of being hunted by invisible detection systems. The Sonobuoy, more than radar, more than depth charges, more than any other single technology, represented the moment when the ocean stopped being a hiding place and became a hunting ground where submarines were prey. The final irony of the Sonobuoy story lies in its simplicity. The device was not exotic or impossibly complex. It was a hydrophone, a radio transmitter, batteries, and a waterproof case, all mass-produced using conventional manufacturing techniques. What made it revolutionary was not technological sophistication but conceptual innovation. The recognition that aircraft mobility and underwater acoustic detection could be combined by deploying disposable sensors. That conceptual leap, made by Allied scientists and engineers in the late 1930s and refined through operational experience, changed submarine warfare permanently. On that morning in May 1943, when Klaus Barksten stood in the conning tower of U-521 and ordered the dive to escape an approaching aircraft, he believed he was executing a maneuver that had protected submarines for decades. By the time he surfaced hours later to surrender, he had learned that the rules had changed. The aircraft that had seemed like a nuisance, forcing submarines down but unable to track them underwater, was now coordinating with surface ships, using information transmitted from sensors floating on the surface, listening to sounds the submarine could not help making. The invisibility that U-boat doctrine depended on was gone, and with it went any realistic chance that Germany could win the Battle of the Atlantic. The submariners who never returned, who died in boats that were found by sonobuoys and destroyed by depth charges, died without knowing why their traditional tactics had failed. They followed procedures that had worked countless times before. They went deep, went quiet, and waited for the enemy to depart. But the enemy never departed because the enemy could hear them, track them, and kill them using technology that seemed to violate the laws of submarine warfare. Those men deserved better than to die confused, fighting an enemy they could not understand using advantages they could not counter. But war is not about fairness or understanding. It is about industrial capacity, technological innovation, and the brutal application of superior resources. In that calculus, the Sonobuoy was simply one more tool in the Allied arsenal, unremarkable to the men who used it, incomprehensible to the men who died because of it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.